everybody. Glad to see you all here this morning. I've just realized I've sat in the creakiest chair in my entire house, so hopefully it's not too distracting if I move around. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm David Card-Howery, Chair of Environmental Science and Sustainability at Drake University, and one of the organizers of the Iowa Climate Educators Group. I'm here with Jean Tockley, Emeritus Professor of Agronomy at Iowa State University, James McCallie, Anson Marston, Distinguished Professor and London Chaired Professor of Power Systems Engineering in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Iowa State, and Jerry Schnorr, Co-Director of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa. We're here today to announce the release of the 11th Annual Iowa Climate Statement, a collaborative effort by researchers and educators from nearly all of Iowa's colleges and universities. We've sent copies of the statement and press release, so check your email for those, and all the information is also on CGR's website. The current statement was endorsed by 223 researchers and educators in climate and climate impacted fields from 34 colleges and universities located in every part of Iowa. These statements, vetted by Iowa's top climate experts, place pivotal climate change research into an Iowa-specific context, encouraging preparedness and resilience in the face of the climate crisis. Previous statements have drawn attention to agricultural impacts as well as human and animal health impacts. We're releasing this statement after yet another extremely difficult year in some parts of Iowa. Over 80% of the state is currently listed as abnormally dry, with over 50% in drought conditions, although hopefully today's rains will help. As we've discussed previously, this is part of a pattern of extreme events, including short-term heavy rainfall and flooding that we expect to see more of under a changing climate. The best way to reduce future damages from climate change is to reduce emissions and find ways to mitigate the extent of climate change as much as possible. Electric infrastructure plays an important role in this effort, as emissions reductions necessarily go hand in hand with increased electrification and a conversion of our grid to renewable and zero emission energies. However, because climate change is currently upon us and it will continue to become more of a threat regardless of reductions for at least the next few decades, it's also critically important that we think differently about infrastructure and resilience in the face of this growing challenge moving forward. Thus, the focus of this year's statement is building the resilience of our electric infrastructure. With that, I'll turn you over to Jean Tockley, who will talk to you about parts of the local threat landscape associated with a changing climate. Jean?
Thank you, Dave. Utility companies having decades of experience refining rapid response to downed power lines have enabled customers to expect power being restored with minimal disruption. But the incremental improvements from past experience have not prepared us for our 21st century vulnerability to the scope of destruction and societal consequences of climate change on the electric generation and distribution system. Each of the recently increasing number of unprecedented climate extremes, such as the derecho in Iowa, the extreme freeze in Texas, and the wildfires in the Western US, have revealed new and disturbing challenges for electric grid reliability. Our Iowa derecho created 110 to 140 mile-an-hour winds that blew down 7 million trees and caused $11 billion in damage to outbuildings, barns, grain bins, homes, mobile homes, and power lines across the central third of Iowa in about 3 hours in August of 2020. Have you ever wondered where all that energy came from? Climate scientists know a lot, but not everything, about how the atmosphere concentrates and releases enormous amounts of energy in a short time in relatively limited regions. But one thing we know for sure is that the increasing levels of carbon dioxide will capture and accumulate increasing amounts of energy in the lowest 8 miles of the Earth's atmosphere. We don't know when or where or in what form such an extreme event could occur again. But a widespread, protracted power outage has happened now once in Iowa, and the continuing accumulation of heat and moisture in the atmosphere due to increases in greenhouse gases is increasing the likelihood of such an event recurring. This year's Iowa climate statement addresses the need to strengthen Iowa's electric infrastructure while at the same time reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions. With that, I'll turn it over to Jim McCauley.
Hi, we have a very well-designed grid in Iowa. Mid-American Alliant, ITC Transmission, and the cooperatives and municipals have done their jobs. They've done their jobs in developing generation resources to make us the #2 state in the nation for wind generation capacity, and to ultimately have a significant solar supply as well. They've done their jobs in developing high voltage transmission to move power from remote wind and solar sites to load centers, and they've done their jobs in providing the lower voltage distribution lines to bring that power into our homes and businesses and interconnect with rooftop solar. However, the future is going to bring winds, extreme temperature events, floods, and droughts at a frequency and severity exceeding conditions for which much of this equipment was designed. To address this, we need to take 3 kinds of strategic actions. First, we need to make the system and its components stronger and better able to withstand extreme events. This is called hardening. It means, for example, increasing transmission and distribution line structural strengths and undergrounding distribution lines, the lower voltage level, where flooding is not a risk. Second, we need to reduce impact and increase speed of restoration and recovery during extreme events. This requires diversification in the ways that we supply power. It means, for example, deploying microgrids for loads providing critical services, such as hospitals and grocery stores, expanding the number of different generation technologies that we use, and most of all, key to all of this, is increasing transmission, a step that provides options under extreme events, strengthens the grid in fundamental ways, and facilitates the interconnection of more wind and solar resources. Third, and finally, we need to be cost conscious while identifying solutions that provide effective hardening and diversification. Our communication today encourages Iowans to work together in identifying effective ways to harden and diversify our power grid, paving the way for growing wind and solar resources while using those resources in concert with strengthened and expanded transmission and distribution infrastructure to reach goals of clean energy, transportation electrification, and decarbonization. I'd like now to introduce Jerry Schnorr, who is the co-director of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa. Jerry? Jerry, you're on mute.
Thanks, Jim. We're running out of time. That's the problem. In the next 9 years, to do our Iowa part, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45%. A monumental effort is truly needed. Socioeconomically disadvantaged people are the most affected by the increased heat and humidity, intense precipitation events, power outages, and flooding that we are currently experiencing, and which will only become worse without climate action. We should protect vulnerable people and safeguard the future of our entire communities. Iowans have done extremely well to move from reliance on coal-fired power to 57% of our electricity generated by wind. In so doing, we've created thousands of high-quality jobs, income for farmers, and taxes to help run our state. In short, we prosper by transitioning to renewable power for our homes, schools, factories, and transportation. This Iowa climate statement emphasizes the need to, quote, strengthen Iowa's electric infrastructure to facilitate this historical and strategic transition. Enhancing the grid will also aid our movement towards electric vehicles and the increased generation capacity necessary to charge them. We benefit in so many ways from strengthening our electric energy infrastructure, and at the same time, we help to address the climate crisis. Back to you, Professor David Korard-Hari.
Thanks, Jerry. We're now going to open up the floor in case there are questions. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and make sure that you are unmuted before asking the question. If you can raise your hand, there's a feature down at reactions. You can click on that. There's raise hand, and I will try to watch for those. But you can also feel free to type a question into the chat box, and we'll get to it as we can. In the interest of time, we'll limit questions to those from the press. So what kind of questions do people have? Yeah, so Erin.
Yeah, I wonder what kind of regulation do you envision or incentives do you envision to encourage power companies to make some of these changes that you're proposing?
Jim, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you know, the word incentives is suggestive that they may not want to do it. Indeed, I think the electric utility transmission owners are eager to enhance and strengthen the infrastructure. You know, and so I think there's two steps in that. One is clearly the population, the community of Iowa needs to be supportive. And then that gets passed on to the regulatory authorities, in our case, the Iowa Utility Board for investor owns, and the board of directors, you know, for different cooperatives and municipals, those in authority of overseeing how to pass those costs on to you and me, really. So incentives, I think, is there in the sense that we have you know, very strong interest in facilitating the grid in an effort to so it can withstand these extreme events.
I guess
I was wondering, sorry, go ahead, Erin.
No, just quick, I was going to follow up. What about regulation? I mean, do you think there needs to be any changes in what the IUB is requiring, or, you know, that there needs to be like energy storage component? I guess that was the second part of my question, just about regulation.
You know, energy storage, I think, is on the agenda for the IUB in several different ways. So I think that's coming, and costs that are incurred at the electric utility companies in order to provide storage, you know, will be absorbed in the rates, you know, as a function of IUB's interest there. I don't know the state of their thinking right now on storage, but I would say in general that you know, as we have these kind of events, we've already seen the derecho in 2020. It's going to be easier and easier to make the case in order to you know, facilitate the cost transfer.
Thanks, Jim. And I should also just add that, you know, our goal here is largely to make people aware of issues that affect Iowans, that, you know, and identify the scientific perspective on those. So while, you know, we all have our thoughts on different ways to improve regulation, the main thing we're trying to communicate is that there's a critical need for these changes, just so that people are aware and can make policy decisions based on that. So Jared, go ahead, Jared Strong.
Yeah, I was curious how you think the public's perception of climate change has shifted in the past 10 years as you've been releasing these statements. And are you optimistic about where we're headed?
Jerry, do you think you'd want to take that one?
Well, I can try. It's a good question, Jared Strong. I believe that people are more receptive to the notion that climate change is real and that it's caused by humans. And I think that movement is reflected in recent polls. I can't quote them to you, but my own experience from talking with the public is that people do realize this is a serious problem and that we will need to act in order to decrease our emissions and harden our infrastructure, including our electric infrastructure. So yes, I see movement, and I believe it's in a positive direction. Of course, the pandemic being our number one problem at the moment has overshadowed some of the desire to go to climate action.
And sorry, just to follow up, do you, excuse me, do you think that we've been moving quickly enough, or do we need to accelerate what we're doing?
No, in fact, I think that's the recent 6th climate assessment by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says clearly, while good things are happening, including renewable energy like wind in Iowa, it's not happening fast enough to avoid dangerous interference with our climate system. So that's the rub. We need somehow to, incentives was used earlier in the press conference, but we need to somehow speed it up, maybe carbon pricing, which is being considered in Congress right now. Maybe some kind of carbon pricing is needed to send a clear signal into the marketplace that fossil fuels have externalities. We need to pay for those somehow, and that will make renewable energy even cheaper by economies of scale.
Great. Kate Payne, and I've been forgetting to ask people to identify who they're with.
Well, I'm with Iowa Public Radio. Thank you so much. So after the derecho, I was pretty astounded to see so many grocery stores without generator capacity to keep food cold. We also heard of small town water wells, running around trying to get generators to keep their water running in the aftermath. So what did that storm, the derecho, tell you all about the lack of planning for some of these critical resources and how vulnerable they may be?
Who wants to handle that one?
I can take a quick shot at it, but I think you're absolutely right that the critical loads maybe have not seen a great deal of attention in terms of establishing ways to keep them online during those kind of events. And that's certainly a very rich direction to head. People have, a lot of discussion today about microgrids, where you essentially develop self-contained, isolatable grids that are capable of sustaining the loads during these kind of events. Microgrids are not good for everywhere. They're probably too costly to do it everywhere, but for certain kinds of loads, it makes a lot of sense. And so moving in the direction of identifying where we can deploy this kind of technology for certain kinds of loads is really, really wise approach. You're right.
And certainly just like with the flooding that we've seen in the last couple of decades, where that intensity's changed, as we move into a sort of new climate regime, it's hard not to get caught a little bit by surprise without a lot of planning, because you're planning for what you've seen, not what you're expecting to see. So certainly it's not a surprise in some sense that we weren't as ready as we could have been for that, just because it was unprecedented. Donnell Eller.
I'm from the Des Moines Register. I wondered if you could expand on the advice to be cost conscious, especially with, I guess, Congress looking at a very large infrastructure package.
So again, I'll try to be succinct, but cost conscious is sort of a fundamental building block for electric utility, because it multiplies so quickly. The cost it becomes so high so very quickly. So we're fortunate here in Iowa to have a relatively low cost of energy for residential. I think it's in the order of 12, 13 cents a kilowatt hour, and this is quite good in the US. And every time you make a decision to enhance, build more, increase the infrastructure, you're essentially ultimately going to add to that cost of energy. And so, it's a mainstay way of thinking that we have to, be thoughtful in this process. And you mentioned the recent bill that was passed by the Senate, infrastructure bill at the federal level. And so there's a $1 trillion bill there that if it gets passed, we hope it will, by the House soon and signed, then there's a lot of funds that will be coming in to Iowa and other states to support this kind of activity. There's definitely significant funding there that is coming from our federal tax dollars.
I guess a follow-up question. Could you give some examples of hardening the infrastructure? Yeah. So I mean, the classic one that many people think about, is underground. It turns out that that's really a little bit hard to do for high voltage transmission, but can be effective for distribution if you're not in a flood zone. So that's one. At the lower voltage levels in several towns around Iowa have been moving in that direction for the lower voltage distribution grid. For transmission, it's more effective to harden the structures. Cross arms, for example, the poles are rated for certain, wind speed and conditions, and so enhancing those ratings and additional guy wires, stronger materials, different kinds of designs for the cross arms. These all make a lot of sense at the transmission level. The other thing that's kind of very simple, but all of the transmission owners and distribution owners have vegetation management. And during a very high windstorm, this can become critical. How far you've been trimming the trees and how low you've been trimming the trees can make a large difference during a storm where you see 100-mile-an-hour winds. So anyway, those are three quite common examples. There's other things that you can do as well at the generation side in weatherizing different infrastructure, but these are some examples.
Great, thanks, Jim. Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig Jamolis from the Gazette newspaper in Cedar Rapids. A quick question for you. You've talked about microgrids. I wonder if you could expand on that more about what you mean by microgrids and how those would work, and detail those a little bit more, because I've not heard, maybe they have, but I've not heard some of our larger utility companies talk about microgrids. So if you could expound on that some more about what you mean by microgrids.
So two maybe very fundamental requirements for a microgrid are that first, that they be able to be disconnected from the grid and continue functioning. So it's typically at the distribution level, lower voltage level, and typically thought of to be a relatively small location area where this would happen. And it would typically happen only under adverse conditions. So the first requirement is isolation capability or disconnecting. The second one is that there needs to be resources in that disconnected grid to supply the load. If there's not resources, solar, wind, whatever kind of resources, generation facilities, then it doesn't make any sense to disconnect, right? So the disconnection of the area from the main grid would be beneficial if there are problems and troubles on supplying that area from the main grid, which we did indeed have during the derecho. So the only other thing I would say about this is that all of the companies that we have in Iowa are very interested in this idea and are funding research and doing demonstration projects. You may not see it implemented yet, but certainly you will be in the near future.
Thanks. Jared, do you have another question?
Yeah, thank you. I put in the chat, but I'm with Iowa Capital Dispatch. I've noticed in reviewing some of the previous statements over the years that the message has shifted somewhat. You know, initially you talked more about warnings of what might come, and now more recently, in recent years, you've been talking about ways to cope with the effects. Does this indicate that you're shifting modes a little bit more from prevention to mitigation?
So, and maybe Gene, if you want to take this in just a second, but I would say definitely, you know, we're seeing more and more some of the impacts that we, you know, had been expecting just in the last couple of decades, and that's shifting. And so, yeah, you know, we are trying to identify that there are things that we're going to need to do to adapt to the new climate regime that we're expecting and that we're seeing. But it's also true that the best way to avoid those damages, especially down the road, remains carbon mitigation, finding ways to reduce. And so one of the things we've been trying to do in recent statements is identify opportunities to do both. So for example, with improving the electric grid and transmission, for example, that can both allow us to install more alternative, you know, energies and reduce our emissions at the same time as it also helps us to prepare for future and expected changes. Gene, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to amplify what you said about more experience now in seeing these locally. It's easy to look at the global rise in temperatures or things that are happening in other places, but if you're not seeing it locally, if you're not experiencing it, if it's not water in your basement, then you don't worry about it so much. But now we have water in our basements, and we have trees that have been blown down. And so climate change has become real to us. With this extra decade of observations that we have since we started these statements, there have been a lot of things that have happened. And we have a better interpretation of the last 30 years, which climate scientists think about as the period of record upon that describes your current status. But what we see now is that even during this last 30-year period, we're seeing extreme increases in precipitation in the April, May, June period. We're seeing statewide increases in humidity in all seasons, but particularly in the spring and summer. And so these are now giving us more confidence, not only that climate change is here, but that it is related to global patterns. And I think particularly this extreme condition we have in the spring in the last 30 years of more rainfall connected to more water flowing to us from the Gulf of Mexico in our atmospheric rivers, it shows us that we are definitely being affected by global climate change.
Kate, go ahead.
Thank you. So we have seen some resistance to building new transmission infrastructure in some rural areas in Iowa and nearby. What is your message to those residents who are wary of these kinds of changes and who might see it as an encroachment on their landscape?
I think that yeah, I am aware that you have there's a number of people that are unhappy with building additional transmission, getting the right of way that it requires, so it's a public discussion that certainly needs to take place, and I think everyone needs to listen very carefully to the concerns. That's my first message, is that it's a good discussion and a healthy one, and people should make their concerns known, and we all need to listen to each other carefully. The second message I would have is that there is no form of energy supply which has no problems. There is no form of energy supply which has zero, which is sort of good for everybody. Everything has its negatives, and so it's not a question of finding the silver bullet, the one thing that doesn't have any negatives. It's a question of finding the technologies that make the best sense, for our purposes and the place that we live. The last thing is that in order to have more wind and solar at a reasonable cost, we're going to have to build more transmission. So this is a well understood, well defended, well supported concept that is really taking shape throughout the country. The transmission capacity that we currently have is insufficient to build out the resources that we need to hit zero carbon. And so if that's not an opinion, it's a fact. So you need to make all of the trade-offs necessary ultimately if we want to get to the point of minimizing the effects of climate change and decarbonizing our infrastructure. This is a step that just, I think we really don't have a choice on.
Are there any other questions? Well, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here and thank the panelists. I think it's been a good conversation. If you have follow-up questions, you can certainly reach out to us. You can talk to Joe about people's availability and so on. But also, one of the benefits of these statements is that hopefully you have a list of people, of the signers on the statements. And you can look there and see if there are local people who you might talk to as well. So anyway, thanks everybody for being here, and we appreciate it. Have a great day.